Picture this. A 4-year-old girl steps off a carriage in the dead of Russian winter, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, as she gazes up at the towering spires of the Winter Palace. She's just a minor German princess, practically penniless, with nothing but ambition burning in her chest and a desperate family's hopes weighing on her shoulders. Within 18 years, this same girl would orchestrate one of the most cunning political coups in history, seduce an entire empire into submission, and become the most powerful woman the world had ever seen. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Catherine the Great's rise to power wasn't built on noble ideals or righteous leadership. It was constructed through a web of sexual manipulation, political seduction, and ruthless calculation that would make Machiavelli himself bow in admiration. This wasn't a fairy tale about a princess finding her prince. This was the story of a master manipulator who used every weapon at her disposal: her intelligence, her sexuality, her charm, and when necessary, her complete lack of moral boundaries, to climb from the bottom of European nobility to the very pinnacle of absolute power. The woman we know as Catherine the Great began her journey as Sophie Friederike Auguste, and what happened between that freezing winter day in 1744 and her coronation as Empress of all Russia is a tale so dark, so twisted, and so brilliant that it reads like a psychological thriller. Because Catherine didn't just marry into power, she seduced it, manipulated it, and ultimately stole it from the very people who thought they could control her. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of propaganda and royal whitewashing to reveal the real story of how a teenage girl with nothing became the most feared and revered ruler in Russian history. We'll explore the calculated moves, the dangerous liaisons, the midnight conspiracies, and the blood that was spilled to pave her path to the throne. This isn't the sanitized version they teach in schools. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about power, ambition, and what happens when someone is willing to sacrifice everything, including their own humanity, to get what they want. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into one of history's most incredible and disturbing transformation stories. By the end of this journey, you'll understand exactly how Catherine didn't just become great. She became something far more dangerous. She became unstoppable. To understand the monster that Catherine would become, we need to go back to her origins, and trust me, they were far from glamorous. Born in 1729 as Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg, she entered the world in a crumbling castle in what is now Poland, to parents who were drowning in debt and desperation. Her father, Christian August, held the impressive-sounding title of Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, but in reality, he was little more than a glorified military officer scraping together a living serving the Prussian army. The family's wealth was mostly on paper, grand titles that came with empty coffers and mounting bills. Sophie's childhood was a masterclass in learning how to survive with nothing but your wits. While other princesses played with golden toys and silk dresses, Sophie learned to charm her way out of situations, to read people's weaknesses, and most importantly, to never let anyone see just how desperate her family really was. Her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was perhaps the first to recognize that her daughter's sharp intelligence and natural charisma were the family's ticket out of poverty. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Johanna didn't see her daughter as a person to be protected and nurtured. She saw her as a commodity to be packaged and sold to the highest bidder. The European marriage market in the 1742 was brutal, especially for minor German nobility. Families like the Anhalt-Zerbsts were constantly playing a dangerous game of musical chairs, desperately trying to marry their children into more powerful houses before their own financial house of cards collapsed entirely. Sophie's parents knew they had one shot, one chance to use their daughter's beauty, intelligence, and royal bloodline, however thin, to save themselves from complete ruin. When Sophie was just 13 years old, whispers began circulating about a potential marriage that could change everything. The Russian Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, was looking for a suitable bride for her heir, the Grand Duke Peter. But here's what makes this story so twisted. Elizabeth wasn't just looking for any German princess. She was specifically seeking someone young, malleable, and desperate enough to completely abandon their former identity to become Russian, someone who could be molded, controlled, and ultimately used as a political pawn. Sophie's mother saw this opportunity like a starving person sees a feast. She immediately began grooming her daughter for what was essentially an audition for the most dangerous job in Europe. Because make no mistake, becoming the wife of the Russian heir wasn't a fairy tale promotion. Previous German princesses who had entered the Russian court had faced exile, imprisonment, and in some cases, mysterious deaths. The Russian court was a viper's nest where one wrong move, one failed political calculation, could result in you disappearing forever. But Sophie's family was out of options. The creditors were closing in. Their reputation was hanging by a thread, and their daughter represented their last hope for survival. So they made a devil's bargain. They would transform their intelligent, spirited daughter into whatever the Russian empress wanted her to be, even if it meant sacrificing every part of her original identity in the process. What her parents didn't realize was that they weren't just sending a naive girl to Russia. They were unleashing someone who had already learned the fundamental lesson that would define her entire reign. When you have nothing left to lose, you become capable of absolutely anything. Sophie had spent her childhood watching her family's desperation, learning to mask their poverty behind a facade of nobility, and understanding that survival in this world meant becoming the predator before someone else made you the prey. As the family prepared for their journey to Russia in 1744, Sophie made a decision that would echo through history. She wouldn't just play the role of the obedient German bride. She would study it, master it, and then rewrite the entire script to serve her own ambitions. The 4-year-old girl who stepped into that carriage wasn't just traveling to a new country. She was traveling toward her destiny as one of history's most ruthless rulers. And the most terrifying part? She already knew exactly what she was willing to do to get there. When Sophie's carriage finally rolled through the gates of the Russian court in February 1744, she stepped into a world that was more alien and dangerous than anything she could have imagined. The Winter Palace wasn't just a residence, it was a battlefield disguised as a ballroom, where every smile concealed a dagger and every conversation was a potential death sentence. But here's what separates Catherine from every other naive foreign bride who had entered these halls. She didn't just survive her first encounter with Russian court politics. She immediately began studying them like a masterclass in human manipulation. Her first test came within hours of her arrival, and it was a test that had destroyed countless other foreign princesses before her. Empress Elizabeth, the woman who held Sophie's entire future in her hands, was a paranoid, volatile ruler who had seized power through her own bloody coup just 3 years earlier. Elizabeth had seen what happened when foreign brides maintained loyalty to their home countries. They became security threats, potential spies, and ultimately political liabilities that had to be eliminated. So Elizabeth had developed a simple but brutal screening process. Any German princess who wanted to marry her heir had to prove their loyalty by completely erasing their former identity. Most girls would have been terrified into submission. Sophie? She saw this as her first opportunity to demonstrate just how dangerous she could be. Within days of her arrival, she made a decision that shocked everyone at court. She would not just meet Elizabeth's demands. She would exceed them so dramatically that the Empress would have no choice but to see her as an asset rather than a threat. First, she attacked the language barrier with an obsession that bordered on fanatical. While other foreign brides struggled with basic Russian phrases for months, Sophie threw herself into learning the language with such intensity that she would stay awake all night practicing until her tongue bled from the effort. But this wasn't just about communication. It was about psychological warfare. Every perfectly pronounced Russian word was a message to the court. I am not some frightened German girl who can be controlled. I am someone who bends reality to her will. Then came the religious conversion, and this is where we see the first glimpse of the calculating monster Catherine would become. Converting from Protestant Christianity to Russian Orthodox wasn't just a matter of changing churches. It was a complete spiritual and cultural transformation that most foreign brides approached with reluctance and fear. Sophie approached it like a master manipulator, studying her target's deepest beliefs so she could exploit them more effectively. She didn't just convert. She became more orthodox than Russians who had been born into the faith. She spent hours in prayer, not out of genuine devotion, but because she understood that religious passion was a language of power that Elizabeth spoke fluently. She studied Orthodox theology with the same intensity that a spy studies their enemy's military tactics. She learned to weep on command during religious ceremonies, to speak about her spiritual transformation with such convincing emotion that even seasoned court observers began to believe she had experienced a genuine miracle of faith. But perhaps the most brilliant part of her performance was how she handled the name change. When she officially became Catherine Alexeyevna on her conversion day, she didn't treat it as a loss of her German identity. She treated it as the birth of something entirely new and far more dangerous. Sophie, the desperate German princess, died that day. What emerged was Catherine, a political shapeshifter who could become whatever she needed to be to achieve her goals. Now, while Catherine was busy seducing an entire empire into believing she was their perfect Russian princess, she also had to deal with the reason she was supposedly there in the first place: her future husband, Grand Duke Peter. And this is where our story takes a turn into territory so bizarre and disturbing that it sounds like something out of a psychological horror novel. Peter was not just a disappointing husband prospect. He was a living nightmare, wrapped in royal privilege. At 17, he was already showing signs of the mental instability and sadistic tendencies that would eventually make him one of the most hated rulers in Russian history. He was obsessed with toy soldiers to the point of mania, would spend hours playing war games while ignoring his actual responsibilities, and had developed a particularly disturbing habit of torturing small animals for entertainment. But here's what makes Catherine's situation so uniquely horrifying. She couldn't just reject this marriage. Her family's survival, her own future, and quite possibly her life depended on making this relationship work. So she had to find a way to not just tolerate Peter, but to manipulate him into believing she was exactly what he wanted, while simultaneously positioning herself to survive whatever psychological damage living with him would cause. Catherine's solution was perhaps the most coldly brilliant piece of relationship manipulation in royal history. She studied Peter the same way a scientist studies a particularly dangerous specimen, carefully, methodically, and with absolutely no emotional attachment. She learned to laugh at his crude jokes, to show interest in his military games, and to present herself as someone who understood and accepted his darker impulses. She became, in essence, his perfect enabler, all while secretly documenting his weaknesses for future use. The wedding took place in August 1745, when Catherine was just 16 years old. The ceremony was a magnificent spectacle that cost more money than most European kingdoms had in their entire treasuries. But behind the golden facade and elaborate celebrations, Catherine was making mental notes about everything and everyone around her. She was studying the power structures, identifying potential allies and enemies, and most importantly, she was beginning to understand that her marriage to Peter wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of her real education in how to seize and hold absolute power. Because even as she stood at the altar promising to love, honor, and obey her new husband, Catherine was already planning something that no one in that glittering crowd could have imagined. She wasn't just going to survive this marriage, she was going to use it as a stepping stone to something far more ambitious. She was going to take everything, the crown, the empire, the power, and she was going to do it so cleverly that by the time anyone realized what was happening, it would already be too late to stop her. The years following Catherine's wedding were when the mask truly came off, revealing the calculating predator that had been hiding behind the facade of the dutiful German bride. What happened between 1745 and 1762 wasn't just a story of an unhappy marriage, it was the methodical construction of one of the most sophisticated power-grabbing operations in human history. And at the center of it all was Catherine's discovery of her most potent weapon: her ability to use intimacy and sexuality as tools of political control. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Catherine's marriage to Peter was not just loveless, it was practically non-existent. Historical records suggest that Peter was either unable or unwilling to consummate their marriage for the first 7 years. Some historians believe he suffered from a medical condition. Others suggest psychological issues, but the result was the same. Catherine found herself trapped in a sexless marriage to a man who was becoming increasingly unstable and cruel with each passing day. For most women of that era, this would have been the end of the story, a life of quiet desperation and unfulfilled duties. But Catherine saw this situation as an opportunity rather than a prison. If Peter couldn't or wouldn't fulfill his role as her husband, then she would find other ways to secure her position and, more importantly, to start building the network of allies she would eventually need to survive in this deadly political environment. Enter Sergei Saltykov, a handsome young courtier who would become Catherine's first lover and quite possibly the father of her first child. But here's what makes this relationship so much darker than a simple case of a lonely wife seeking comfort. Catherine didn't choose Saltykov out of love or even lust. She chose him as part of a calculated strategy to solve multiple political problems at once. She needed to produce an heir to secure her position, she needed to understand how sexual power worked in the Russian court, and she needed to start practicing the art of compartmentalizing her emotions for political gain. The affair with Saltykov was Catherine's graduate course in manipulation. She learned how to conduct secret relationships under the noses of the most paranoid intelligence network in Europe. She learned how to use physical intimacy to extract information, loyalty, and favors. Most importantly, she learned how to completely separate her emotional life from her political calculations, a skill that would prove essential when she later had to order the deaths of people she had once been intimate with. When Catherine gave birth to Paul in 1754, the question of paternity was deliberately left ambiguous. Peter, desperate to appear virile and competent, claimed the child as his own. Catherine never corrected him, but she also never confirmed it. This ambiguity wasn't an accident. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering that gave Catherine leverage over both Peter and the court. If Paul was Peter's son, then Catherine had fulfilled her duty as a wife. If Paul wasn't Peter's son, then Catherine had demonstrated that she could produce heirs even when her husband couldn't, making her potentially more valuable to the empire than Peter himself. But Catherine's sexual relationships weren't just about solving immediate problems. They were about building a power base that would eventually allow her to challenge the entire system. Each lover was carefully chosen not just for physical attraction, but for their political connections, their military influence, or their ability to provide her with information about potential threats and opportunities. Take Stanisław Poniatowski, her second major affair. Poniatowski wasn't just a Polish nobleman. He was a future king who could potentially provide Catherine with international allies if she ever needed to defend herself against accusations of illegitimacy or treason. Their relationship gave Catherine insight into European politics beyond the Russian court, and more importantly, it gave her practice in managing relationships with powerful men who had their own political agendas. Then there was Grigory Orlov, perhaps the most strategically important relationship of Catherine's early years. Orlov wasn't just another handsome courtier. He was a military officer with connections to the Imperial Guard, the same force that had put Elizabeth on the throne and could potentially do the same for Catherine. Through Orlov, Catherine gained access to military intelligence, learned about troop loyalties, and began to understand how coups were planned and executed in Russia. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these relationships was how Catherine managed to maintain them all simultaneously, while presenting herself to the court as a devoted wife and mother. She developed an elaborate system of coded communications, secret meeting places, and trusted intermediaries that allowed her to conduct multiple affairs while appearing to be above suspicion. She became a master of what we might now call compartmentalization, the ability to switch between different personas depending on what the situation required. Meanwhile, Peter was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. As he grew older, his childhood sadism evolved into more sophisticated forms of cruelty. He began making public statements about his admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's enemy, which was tantamount to treason. He treated his wife with open contempt, making crude jokes about her in public and threatening to divorce her and send her to a convent, which, in the Russian context, was essentially a death sentence disguised as religious retirement. But here's where Catherine's years of careful preparation began to pay off. Instead of being terrified by Peter's threats, she saw them as confirmation that she had been right to prepare for this moment. Every lover she had cultivated, every secret she had learned, every alliance she had built was suddenly revealed to be part of a larger strategy that she had been unconsciously developing for nearly 2 decades. When Empress Elizabeth died in January 1762, Peter ascended to the throne as Peter III, and within months, he had managed to alienate virtually every important constituency in the Russian Empire. He immediately began negotiations to end Russia's successful war against Prussia, essentially giving away military victories that had cost thousands of Russian lives. He started implementing policies that threatened the Orthodox Church, which controlled the hearts and minds of the Russian people. Most dangerously, he began making plans to use the military against Denmark to reclaim his ancestral lands in Holstein, a move that would have been seen as prioritizing his German heritage over Russian interests. Each of Peter's mistakes was an opportunity that Catherine had been preparing for her entire adult life. She had spent 17 years studying the Russian court, learning its power structures, and building relationships with the people who could make or break an aspiring ruler. She had learned to speak Russian better than many native speakers, to understand Orthodox theology better than most priests, and to navigate court politics better than nobles who had been born into the system. Most importantly, she had learned that in the Russian Empire, power didn't come from birthright or legal succession. It came from the ability to convince the right people that you deserved to rule. And by 1762, Catherine had convinced not just a few lovers or court allies, but entire segments of the military, the church, and the nobility that she was more Russian than the Russian-born Peter, more orthodox than most believers, and more capable of defending the empire's interests than the man who was legally its ruler. The stage was set for what would become one of the most audacious power grabs in history. But Catherine's coup wouldn't succeed because of luck, or because Peter was particularly weak. It would succeed because Catherine had spent nearly 2 decades methodically preparing for this exact moment, building the relationships and acquiring the skills that would allow her to do something that most people would consider impossible: convince an entire empire to betray their legal ruler in favor of a foreign-born woman who had no legitimate claim to the throne whatsoever. The little German girl who had arrived with nothing but ambition was about to reveal just how dangerous someone becomes when they've had 20 years to plan their revenge against a world that underestimated them. The night of the 28th of June, 1762, would go down in history as one of the most brilliantly executed coups ever conceived. But what most people don't realize is that it wasn't really planned in a single night. It was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of psychological manipulation, sexual politics, and strategic relationship building that Catherine had been orchestrating since she was a teenager. What happened that summer night wasn't just a palace revolution, it was the moment when all of Catherine's careful investments in human manipulation finally paid their ultimate dividend. By the summer of 1762, Peter III had been emperor for just 6 months, but he had managed to accomplish what Catherine couldn't have achieved in years of plotting. He had made himself so universally hated that overthrowing him wasn't just possible, it was practically inevitable. The question wasn't whether someone would move against Peter. The question was who would be bold enough to seize the moment and claim the throne for themselves. Peter's final, fatal mistake came when he decided to personally lead a military campaign against Denmark to reclaim his Holstein territories. This wasn't just politically suicidal. It was a strategic gift to Catherine that she had been waiting her entire adult life to receive. By taking the Imperial Guard out of St. Petersburg with him, Peter was essentially removing the one force that could protect him from a coup attempt. But more importantly, he was giving Catherine the opportunity to present herself as the defender of Russian interests against a ruler who was literally trying to drag the country into a foreign war for his personal benefit. Catherine's network of allies moved into action with a precision that would have impressed any military strategist. The plan they executed wasn't improvised. It was the activation of relationships and promises that had been carefully cultivated for years. Every person who participated in Catherine's coup had been personally recruited, tested, and bound to her through a combination of sexual attraction, political obligation, or strategic mutual interest. The coup began at dawn on the 28th of June, when Alexei Orlov, brother of Catherine's lover Grigory, arrived at the palace where Catherine was staying and woke her with words that must have sent electricity through her entire body. It's time to reign. But here's what makes this moment so chilling. She had been expecting this moment, preparing for it, and when it finally came, she moved with the calculated precision of someone executing a plan they had rehearsed 1,000 times in their mind. Within hours, Catherine was riding through the streets of St. Petersburg in a borrowed uniform, presenting herself not as a usurping foreign wife, but as the rightful defender of Russian Orthodox values against a heretical, pro-Prussian pretender. This wasn't just brilliant political theatre. It was the culmination of years of studying how Russian power transitions actually worked. Catherine understood that legitimacy in Russia didn't come from legal succession, it came from divine sanction as interpreted by the Orthodox Church and validated by military force. The role of the military in Catherine's coup reveals just how sophisticated her long-term planning had been. Through her relationship with Grigory Orlov, she had spent years building relationships with officers throughout the Imperial Guard. But these weren't just casual friendships. They were carefully constructed bonds of personal loyalty that combined sexual attraction, political promises, and financial incentives. Catherine had essentially created a shadow military command structure that was more loyal to her than to the official chain of command. When the moment came, entire regiments declared for Catherine not because they believed in her legal right to rule, but because their officers had been personally convinced that supporting her was in their own best interests. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising of patriotic soldiers, it was the activation of a conspiracy that had been built one relationship at a time over nearly 2 decades. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Catherine's coup was how she managed to frame the narrative before Peter even knew what was happening. By the time news of the revolt reached Peter, Catherine had already been proclaimed empress by the Senate, blessed by the Orthodox Church, and acclaimed by the people of St. Petersburg. Peter wasn't just being overthrown, he was being presented as someone who had already lost legitimacy through his own actions. The psychological warfare that Catherine employed during these crucial hours reveals the true depth of her manipulative genius. She didn't just defeat Peter militarily, she destroyed him psychologically by making him understand that his own wife had been playing a game so far beyond his comprehension that he had never even realized he was a player. When Peter finally grasped the scope of what Catherine had accomplished, it broke something fundamental in his already fragile psyche. Peter's surrender came not through military defeat, but through the realization that he had been completely outmaneuvered by someone he had consistently underestimated and humiliated. The man who had spent years mocking his wife's intelligence, dismissing her political acumen, and threatening to send her to a convent, suddenly found himself facing the reality that she had been building the instruments of his destruction while he played with toy soldiers. But the most chilling moment of the entire coup came after Peter's abdication, when Catherine had to decide what to do with her former husband. This wasn't just a practical political problem. It was the ultimate test of whether Catherine had truly transformed from the desperate German girl into the ruthless ruler she claimed to be. A living Peter would always be a potential rallying point for counter-revolution. A dead Peter would remove that threat permanently, but would also brand Catherine as a regicide in the eyes of Europe. Catherine's solution was characteristic of her approach to power. She would let others make the dirty choice, while maintaining plausible deniability for herself. Peter was placed under guard at Ropsha Palace, officially for his own protection. Catherine's public statements expressed concern for her former husband's welfare and hopes for his comfortable retirement. But privately, she made sure that the men guarding Peter understood that a live former emperor was a problem that needed to be solved. On the 17th of July, 1762, less than 3 weeks after Catherine's coup, Peter III died at Ropsha Palace. The official cause was listed as hemorrhoidal colic, essentially claiming that the former emperor of Russia had died from severe hemorrhoids. The real cause was almost certainly murder. carried out by guards who understood that eliminating Peter permanently would earn them Catherine's gratitude and protection. Catherine's reaction to news of Peter's death was a masterpiece of calculated emotion. She publicly expressed shock and grief, ordered prayers for her late husband's soul, and made all the appropriate gestures of a widow mourning her loss. But privately, those close to her reported that she received the news with what could only be described as relief mixed with satisfaction. The last obstacle to her complete control of power had been permanently removed. What makes Catherine's coup so uniquely terrifying isn't just that she succeeded in overthrowing her husband and seizing absolute power. It's how completely she had planned and orchestrated every aspect of the operation, while maintaining the facade of being a loyal, submissive wife. For nearly 20 years, she had been building the instruments of Peter's destruction while he remained completely oblivious to the danger he was in. The three-year-old woman who emerged from this crisis as Catherine I, Empress of all Russia, was no longer the desperate German princess who had arrived in Moscow as a teenager. She was something far more dangerous, a ruler who had proven she could use every aspect of human psychology: love, lust, loyalty, fear, ambition, and religious devotion as weapons in service of her political goals. She had seduced not just individuals, but an entire empire into believing that overthrowing their legal ruler in favor of a foreign-born usurper was not just acceptable, but necessary for the survival of Russia itself. Catherine had won the ultimate prize, but the methods she had used to claim it would define her entire reign. She had proven that with enough patience, intelligence, and ruthless calculation, it was possible to manipulate any system, overthrow any opponent, and claim any prize. The question that would haunt the rest of her reign was simple. If Catherine was capable of this level of deception and manipulation against her own husband, what exactly was she planning to do with the absolute power she had just claimed? Now that Catherine had achieved the impossible, seizing absolute power over the largest empire on earth through sheer manipulation and political seduction, the real question became, what kind of ruler would someone with her particular skill set actually become? The answer reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her entire story. Catherine didn't abandon the methods that had brought her to power once she claimed the throne. Instead, she refined them, systematized them, and deployed them on a scale that would make her one of the most effective and terrifying rulers in human history. Catherine's approach to imperial power was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Traditional monarchs ruled through a combination of inherited legitimacy, military force, and religious authority. Catherine ruled through what we might now recognize as a form of mass psychological manipulation. She convinced an entire empire that submitting to her will wasn't just politically necessary, but personally fulfilling for her subjects. Take her approach to the nobility, the class that had the most power to challenge her rule. Instead of simply demanding their obedience, Catherine made them complicit in their own subjugation by giving them the illusion of partnership in her grand vision for Russia. She expanded their privileges, gave them greater control over their serfs, and created elaborate court ceremonies that made them feel like essential participants in imperial glory, rather than merely subjects to be controlled. But here's the truly sinister part. While Catherine was flattering the nobility into complacency, she was simultaneously gathering detailed intelligence on each of them through her network of lovers, spies, and informants. She knew their financial situations, their personal relationships, their political ambitions, and most importantly, their individual weaknesses. This wasn't just good government. It was systematic psychological profiling designed to ensure that she always knew exactly how much pressure to apply to any individual who might consider opposing her. Catherine's sexual relationships as Empress reveal perhaps the most calculated aspect of her character. Her affairs weren't the random indulgences of a powerful woman following her desires. They were carefully orchestrated political appointments disguised as romance. Each lover was selected not just for physical attraction, but for their strategic value in maintaining her power structure. Consider Grigory Potemkin, perhaps the most famous of Catherine's lovers, and certainly the most politically significant. Potemkin wasn't just a handsome officer who caught Catherine's eye. He was a military genius who could help her expand Russian territory, a political strategist who could help her navigate complex international relationships, and most importantly, someone whose ambitions were large enough that he needed Catherine's patronage to achieve them, making him simultaneously valuable and controllable. The relationship between Catherine and Potemkin illustrates the Empress's mastery of what we might call intimate imperialism, the use of personal relationships to extend political control. Catherine didn't just make Potemkin her lover, she made him her partner in creating a shared fantasy of Russian greatness that was so compelling that it became the organizing principle for the entire empire. Together, they orchestrated military campaigns, urban planning projects, and cultural initiatives that convinced millions of people that serving Catherine's vision was the highest form of patriotic duty. But perhaps the most chilling example of Catherine's manipulative genius was how she handled the problem of serfdom, the system of agricultural slavery that formed the economic foundation of her empire. Catherine was intellectually convinced that serfdom was morally wrong and economically inefficient. She corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers who had convinced her that free labor was more productive than slave labor, and she privately acknowledged that Russia's treatment of its peasants was barbaric, even by the standards of the 18th century. So what did Catherine do with this knowledge? Did she use her absolute power to liberate millions of enslaved people? Of course not. Instead, she expanded and systematized serfdom while simultaneously writing eloquent essays about human freedom and dignity. She gave the nobility even greater control over their serfs, while publicly positioning herself as an enlightened ruler who cared deeply about the welfare of all her subjects. This wasn't hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It was something far more sophisticated and disturbing. Catherine understood that her power depended on maintaining the existing economic system while appearing to transcend it morally. She solved this problem by creating an elaborate public relations campaign that convinced both her subjects and foreign observers that she was working toward eventual reform while ensuring that such reforms would never actually threaten the foundations of her power. The Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775 revealed just how far Catherine was willing to go to maintain control when her system of soft manipulation failed. When Emelian Pugachev, a Cossack leader, claimed to be the real Peter III and launched a massive peasant uprising that threatened to overthrow Catherine's entire regime, her response was swift, brutal, and designed to send a message that would echo through generations. Catherine didn't just defeat Pugachev militarily. She orchestrated his capture, trial, and execution as a piece of public theatre designed to demonstrate what happened to anyone who challenged her authority. Pugachev was brought to Moscow in a cage, subjected to public torture, and executed in a manner specifically calculated to terrorize potential future rebels. But even more telling was what Catherine did after Pugachev's death. She systematically erased his name from official records and banned any public discussion of the rebellion, essentially attempting to delete the entire episode from Russian historical memory. This combination of mass manipulation and selective terror became Catherine's signature approach to imperial control. She would seduce, flatter, and convince when possible, but she was always prepared to deploy overwhelming violence when her softer methods failed. The key to her success was that most of her subjects never saw the violence because they had been so effectively convinced that serving Catherine was in their own best interests. Catherine's relationship with Enlightenment philosophy provides perhaps the most disturbing insight into her character. She genuinely admired thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, corresponded with them regularly, and appeared to embrace many of their ideas about human reason, natural rights, and political progress. But Catherine didn't adopt Enlightenment principles because she believed in them. She adopted them because she understood their propaganda value in legitimizing her rule to educated European opinion. Catherine's nakaz, or instruction, her famous legal code that was supposedly based on Enlightenment principles, reads like a masterpiece of progressive political theory. It calls for legal equality, religious tolerance, and humane treatment of criminals. But Catherine never actually implemented most of these reforms, and when she did, it was always in ways that strengthened her personal control, rather than genuinely liberating her subjects. By the time of Catherine's death in 1796, she had ruled Russia for 34 years and transformed it from a relatively minor European power into a dominant empire that stretched from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. She had added over 200,000 square miles to Russian territory, established new cities, founded universities, and created cultural institutions that rivaled anything in Western Europe. But perhaps her most lasting achievement was the system of control she created, a form of governance that combined mass manipulation, selective terror, and elaborate propaganda in ways that would influence authoritarian rulers for centuries to come. Catherine proved that with sufficient intelligence, patience, and ruthless calculation, it was possible to convince people that their own subjugation was actually their liberation. The woman who died in 1796 was no longer the desperate German teenager who had arrived in Russia 52 years earlier. She had become something unprecedented in human history. A ruler who had mastered the art of making absolute power appear to be a form of public service. She had seduced not just individuals, but entire populations into believing that serving her interests was the highest form of patriotic duty. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it had worked. Catherine died beloved by her subjects, respected by her enemies, and remembered by history as Catherine the Great. She had proven that with the right combination of manipulation, charisma, and strategic violence, it was possible to commit almost any act of oppression while maintaining a reputation as an enlightened, benevolent ruler. The teenager who had learned to survive by reading people's weaknesses and exploiting their desires had become an empress who could manipulate the hopes and fears of millions. She had taken the lessons learned in palace bedrooms and applied them to the governance of continents. In the end, Catherine didn't just conquer territories, she conquered the very concept of legitimate authority itself, proving that power doesn't come from birthright or divine sanction, but from the ability to convince people that their ruler deserves to rule them. So here we are, at the end of one of history's most disturbing success stories. We followed Catherine from a desperate 4-year-old German princess with nothing but ambition to an empress who ruled over 1/6 of the world's landmass and nearly 40 million people. But as we reach the conclusion of this journey, the question we need to ask ourselves isn't just how Catherine achieved the impossible. It's what her story reveals about the nature of power itself, and why her methods continue to echo through the corridors of authority even today. Catherine's death in 1796 was as calculated as everything else in her life. She died at the height of her power, having successfully transferred her authority to her son Paul while maintaining control over her own legacy. Even in death, she managed to avoid the fate that had befallen so many other Russian rulers: assassination, revolution, or historical irrelevance. She died as she had lived for the previous 34 years, completely in control of her own narrative. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Catherine's legacy isn't what she accomplished during her lifetime. It's how successfully she convinced history to remember her on her own terms. The woman we call Catherine the Great was a master manipulator who expanded slavery, crushed peasant rebellions with unprecedented brutality, and ruled through a combination of seduction, propaganda, and selective terror. Yet she's remembered as an enlightened monarch who modernized Russia and championed progressive values. This isn't an accident of historical interpretation. It's the final victory of Catherine's lifelong strategy of controlling narratives and shaping perceptions. Even centuries after her death, we're still seeing the world through the lens she created, still believing the story she wanted us to believe about who she was and what she represented. Catherine's techniques of power didn't die with her. If you look carefully at modern politics, you can see her fingerprints everywhere. The use of charisma to mask authoritarian intentions, the deployment of progressive rhetoric to justify oppressive policies, the cultivation of personal loyalty networks that transcend institutional boundaries, the strategic use of sexuality and intimacy as tools of political control. These aren't ancient historical curiosities. They're the operating principles of power in the modern world. Consider how many contemporary leaders have risen to power by presenting themselves as outsiders who will reform corrupt systems, only to use their positions to create even more sophisticated forms of control. Think about how often we see rulers who speak eloquently about human rights, while systematically undermining the freedoms of their own people. Reflect on how frequently political movements that begin with promises of liberation end up creating new forms of oppression that are more subtle but no less effective than what came before. Catherine pioneered what we might call the soft authoritarianism that has become the dominant form of political control in the modern era. She proved that it's possible to maintain absolute power without appearing to be a tyrant, to crush opposition while claiming to champion freedom, and to manipulate millions of people while convincing them that they're participants in their own liberation. But perhaps the most important lesson from Catherine's story isn't about political power, it's about the danger of being seduced by our own desires for simple narratives and heroic figures. Catherine understood that people want to believe in leaders who embody their highest aspirations, and she used that desire as a weapon against the very people who elevated her to power. We want to believe that Catherine was either a villain or a hero, either a brilliant reformer or a ruthless dictator. But the truth is far more disturbing. She was both and neither. She was someone who understood that the categories we use to judge historical figures are often inadequate to capture the complexity of how power actually works. She knew that the most effective way to maintain control wasn't to reject moral categories entirely, but to position herself as the embodiment of whatever moral vision her audience most wanted to see. The teenage girl who stepped off that carriage in 1744 with nothing but ambition and intelligence had become something unprecedented in human history. A ruler who had mastered the art of making oppression feel like empowerment, who had turned manipulation into a form of mass entertainment, and who had convinced an entire civilization that serving her interests was the highest expression of their own values. Catherine's story forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions about ourselves and our own susceptibility to manipulation. How many of the leaders we admire have used similar techniques to gain and maintain power? How often do we mistake charisma for competence, progressive rhetoric for actual reform, or personal charm for genuine care about our welfare? How many times have we been seduced by the very same techniques that Catherine used to convince an empire to submit to her will? The most terrifying thing about Catherine the Great isn't that she was a uniquely evil person. It's that she was probably a lot like many of the people we encounter in positions of power today. She was intelligent, charismatic, capable of genuine charm and affection, and she probably believed that her actions were justified by the results she achieved. She wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She was something far more dangerous, a fundamentally amoral person with the intelligence and patience to systematically exploit every weakness in human nature for her own benefit. In the end, Catherine's greatest achievement wasn't conquering territory or building cities, or even ruling effectively for over 3 decades. Her greatest achievement was proving that with sufficient intelligence, patience, and ruthless calculation, it's possible to convince people that their own oppression is actually their liberation. She showed that the most effective form of control isn't the kind that relies on fear and violence, but the kind that makes people grateful for their own subjugation. And that's why Catherine the Great's story isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a warning. It's a reminder that the techniques she pioneered haven't disappeared with the Russian Empire. They've evolved, they've been refined, and they're being used by people in positions of power all around us, right now, today. The next time you find yourself inspired by a leader's charisma, moved by their progressive rhetoric, or convinced that they truly understand and care about your concerns, remember Catherine. Remember the 4-year-old girl who learned to survive by reading people's weaknesses and exploiting their desires. Remember how she used those same skills to convince an entire empire that serving her interests was the highest form of patriotic duty. Because somewhere out there, in boardrooms and political offices and media studios around the world, there are people who have studied Catherine's methods and learned her lessons. They know how to make you feel seen, understood, and empowered while they systematically strip away your actual power. They know how to convince you that your oppression is really your liberation, that their success is really your victory, and that questioning their authority is really a betrayal of your own values. Catherine the Great's darkest legacy isn't the territory she conquered or the people she ruled. It's the proof she provided that with the right combination of intelligence, charisma, and moral flexibility, anyone can convince anyone of anything. She showed us that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who reject our values, but the ones who understand our values well enough to use them against us. That's the real lesson of Catherine the Great. The most effective predators aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who look exactly like what we most want to see.